I had a student in my class who's the National Merit Scholar who was admitted to Alma College on a full scholarship. So this student had all A's on his transcripts, never seen anything else throughout years of schooling. And one day he got up in front of the class and he wanted to present a problem. And he tried, and then he turned around, he faced the group, he said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this because I have not worked the problem ahead of time." After the class, he followed me into my office, and he was concerned because he realized that for the first time in his life, he actually had to work to get an A. I think this student is an example of a group of students who are exceptionally smart, who can get perfect academic records without ever having to work, or work very little. And they go through our regular school system, taking classes, going through lectures, taking exams, and get perfect A's. They were untouched, unchallenged, ever. I was very pleased that I was able to challenge even the brightest students. And I think this is a good example of how deep of the understanding students have to develop in the IBL course.
My most memorable IBL experience was teaching a pointed topology class for third-year undergraduates. It was about 1 month into the course, and I had just introduced the students to the definition of convergence and limit of a sequence in an arbitrary topological space. And they were solving elementary problems when one of the students raised his hand and said, "I don't have a question, but I have a comment I have to make. I'm being very uncomfortable with the fact that sequences can have more than one limit." And another student reacted to that saying, "Well, I've been thinking about the same thing, and with the examples we had, I noticed that the discrete topology and the indiscrete topology, which are opposites, in one case there are too many limits, in one case there are not enough." And she posed the question, "I wonder whether there is a threshold for when this can or cannot happen, from when a sequence can have more than one limit." And at this moment, I have to make an effort not to say anything, because the questions he had posed was exactly the same questions that topologists had asked themselves the first time they developed the field of pointed topology. So it was a really good question. And I'm used to students developing conjectures, but I wasn't used to a student coming up with the right questions before me asking them. So I simply kept calm and say, "Okay, that's a good question," because the class was agreeing and more people said that that's something they wanted to think about. So I just told them, "Think about it." I'll add it to the notes, and pretending it wasn't a big deal, even though it was. And then for the next week, while we continued with the rest of the material, every day we would come back to these questions and they would present their progress. And one student came the next day saying, "I have a conjecture. I think that in a topological space, a sequence can never have more than one limit, if and only if," and he wrote a condition. And that condition, not in the most clean way written, was actually the definition of Hausdorff, which is the right topological notion that normally is introduced as an ad hoc thing. And in this case, the student had come up with itself naturally. And he stated that it was an if and only if. And the class believed that it was a sufficient condition, but wouldn't let him say it was necessary because he didn't have a proof. And so they continued thinking. And another student the next day said, "Well, I haven't been able to prove that it is necessary, but I've proven that something weaker is necessary." And the notion this student had obtained was the notion of T1, another separation axiom. And then another student came with a counterexample that showed that being Hausdorff is not necessary, it's only sufficient. And another student came with a example that showed that being Ty is necessary but not sufficient. And then they put it all together. And then at this moment, while this was all going, I just had to control myself, because inside I was doing a happy dance, because all I had done was given the students a definition of limit and convergence of a sequence. And by themselves, without any prompting from me other than, "Okay, why don't you think about that?" and nothing else, they had been able to come up with the right question, and then with the right conjecture, and then they had been able to prove the conjecture false and improve upon it, and finally complete the theory. And I had been doing nothing, just observing them. And that was the day that I basically fell in love with IBL, and I decided that I truly believe in this format and that the skills the students were gaining were worth it.
My most memorable IBL experience, I have two, The first one was the first time that I went to the RL MARR conference and the workshop that was beforehand at that time in 2010. I distinctly remember getting there the first day and not knowing what to expect and thinking, oh my gosh, these are my people. As soon as we started working, they just completely validated everything I'd thought about how math should be taught and how students should interact and how they should practice and really become mathematicians rather than just regurgitators. My second most memorable IBL experience was after I had attended the workshop and the Legacy Conference in 2010, I decided to teach my own intro proofs class, IBL, at North Carolina State University where I was a grad student. I didn't really ask anyone for permission, I just sort of flew under the radar and did it to see what would happen. I had some struggles, some of the normal struggles that novice instructors have, but I found that my students really just leaps and bounds learned. So the grad students at NC State have to tutor in a tutoring lab, and we get students from any class in there. I was giving a test in my intro proofs class later that day, and there were a couple students from another section of the same course, and they're doing work, and they were asking for help and bemoaning how hard the class was. A couple of my students came in and I explained to one of them, answered a question for her, and we worked through something. And a second student came in to ask on a similar topic, and I started to explain it to him before she quickly said, oh, I've got it, I'll explain it to him. You can go help other people, we can do this. So they worked together, and another student came in and they kept working together. They eventually moved up to the whiteboard in the room and started working out proofs on the board, and I went over to see what they were doing, and they quickly told me to get away, we can do it on our own, we'll call you if we need your help. And one of the other people in there getting help, who was a student in the same course but in a different section, looked at me and said, why are there grad students in here working? And I said, oh no, those are my students, they're in the same class you're in. And she said, but they understand what they're doing. I said, they do, they've worked really hard to understand what they're doing. She said, they're doing it without you. I said, they are. And I couldn't have been prouder of my students for learning how to do things on their own and being so sure and confident in themselves that they could get it and willing to work on things even though they didn't have an answer, that they were willing to shoo me away.
My name is Fong Lee. I teach at Niagara University. I've only taught one course using IBL, but it was transformational. And the most memorable story I can think of using IBL was I had two students, one of which was very talkative and the other was very quiet. And I always teased the talkative guy. I knew he could take it, and I said, you know, eventually you'll say the right thing, but it might take you a while. And the quiet student, you know, it took a while for me to kind of get into her head and figure out her process. And I realized she was actually a really good listener. She was trying, she put forth a lot of effort, but she was quiet. And eventually I realized I'm going to pair them together and have this guy say all his stuff, and he's just going to rant and go on, say every idea that in his head, no filter whatsoever. And I told her, listen, he's going to say the right thing. I know he will eventually. It's your job to find it. And it worked beautifully. He would say things, and she would say, well, what about this? And you said this back there. Can you say it again? And they were incredible partners. And you know, sometimes, I mean, he would certainly eventually rely on her as the filter, but she would take his ideas and refine them and present them beautifully, or he would present something and then she would come up and tell him exactly where the real answer is versus all this other stuff. And you know, that's really what I enjoyed about the process. I had very little to do with it. I just said, hey, listen to him, he's saying some good stuff. And I said, hey, answer her questions when he had some, and that's all I really did. And it just worked magically. It was great. And that's kind of the most memorable IBL story I have. It's something that I think about often as I plan my next courses.
My most memorable IBL experience is a course I taught in the spring of 2013. I did this course called Introduction to Graph Labeling, which is in my research area. And so I had a chance to write some course notes for that class. And so I had about 7 students, and every day we came in and I gave them a new handout of some of the course notes that I had written, and they put problems up on the board from the night before, and the experience was just really great because they were really engaged in the material. and they helped sort of edit those notes as we went along. It was a new thing for me, and so they were really helpful in making that those course notes better. And as we went on, you know, it got a little bit harder, and they weren't really sure about it, so the course kind of changed a little bit, and students started working in class before we presented each day. So they kind of came in and worked a little bit before they could present because they were a little nervous about what they had done. And then towards the end, I had them do presentations, and I didn't give them much guidance. I just told them I wanted them to present on a different kind of labeling than we had studied in class. And a lot of them chose, all of them chose actually some sort of inquiry-based approach within their lecture, right? I guess it wasn't a lecture, but within their presentation, they all had some sort of guided sort of discovery of something, which was really cool because I didn't even ask them to do that, but they had bought into the method, and they were excited about it. One student even wrote his own sort of course notes for his project, and so I have more notes to add to what I had done. So that was kind of an experience that was really great for I think all the students involved and for me as well.
My name is Perry Lee from Kutztown University. My most memorable experience just happened recently, past spring 2014 semester. I teach a large college algebra classroom, and there was this one particular student who had apprehension about her abilities at the beginning of the semester. I had assured her that if you work hard, contribute to classroom discussion, then you will do well. And well, the first month didn't look too great. And I thought, oh boy, she had left this college algebra class to her last semester. She was supposedly to graduate in May, which she did, but I was overly concerned. So during that time, I was able to you know, see her during office hours, and she actually initiated a lot of the coming into my office hours to talk and talk about the problems she was having, and you know, and so she sought for a lot of advice. So in one particular presentation that she was asked to perform, I mean to work on, she was struggling. It was on polynomials, sketching polynomial functions. And I had asked her to, she did not know how to sketch, so I had guided her by asking a series of questions. Also students from the class also did the same thing. And then for some reason, the light bulb went on. And boy, did she do an amazing job. Went way beyond what I actually requested.
I'm Patrick McLaughlin, and I'm from Kutztown University of Pennsylvania. And my most memorable IBL experience actually has to be broken up into two. One as a student, one as a faculty member. As a student, I was a high school student, went to National Science Foundation Summer Math Institute at Auburn University in 1977, and it was taught more method by Steve Brown, Jack Rogers, and Volodymyr Kuperberg. And I struggled for the first week, having to adapt to it. And one day, Thursday or Friday, I went up to the board and I presented a proof. And it wasn't the most elegant, it wasn't the most beautiful, but it was a good proof. And I got congratulated for it. And I beat out a couple of other students, Joseph Yu-Chung Yu and Steve Cusio. I still remember that I got that term before they did. And that was such an experience. You cannot package that kind of endorphins running through your body. I used to play a lot of tennis too. And that kind of feeling of success, authentic success, was one of the most important IBL moments in my life. And as a professor, I've seen a plethora of those kinds of experiences. And one of my favorite ones was a student a couple of years ago, Mr. Jablonski, who went to the board. And he presented in real analysis an argument, and it was wrong. And he was very frustrated because he thought he was right. The other students pointed out he was wrong. And as usual, in a more method class, I said, well, Mr. Jablonski, go ahead, sit down. You can present again next time if you have it. Does anybody else have a proof for this? And no one else did, but Mr. Jablonski had been sitting there very quietly, almost like he was pouting. But he goes, wait a minute, I have to go back up. And he went back up. and he fixed his own proof in a pretty short amount of time. And if you could see the expression on his face, that was the same kind of expression I think I had 30 years earlier. And I've seen that in many, many, many students.